Welcome back to the second half of our event this morning, which starts with some opening remarks from our panelists, followed by a discussion and some question and answers. And then Chris Millward will conclude this morning's event with a keynote speech on the work that the OFS is doing to address the decline in adult learner participation and set out what he sees as the opportunities ahead. Just for your information, we had some 300 people join the event in part one. It's great of you to see so many of you back for this second half. And a quick reminder that we're inviting you to submit questions for the panel using the Q&A box in Zoom. And please include your name and organisation if you're happy for those to be read out. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Brooke Storer-Church, who is Head of Skills at the Office for Students, to introduce the panel session and discussion. Brooke, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Welcome everyone to the second part of our event, which focuses, as Nicola just said, on a panel discussion preceded by some short remarks from each of our panelists. Just a reminder, please do submit questions as you have them. I'll feed these into the panel to spur on a discussion, and I will name who has asked the question. Unless you prefer not to be, you can put them in anonymized if so. Delighted today that we are starting this discussion with short contributions from two panelists, Joe Barlow and Liz Johnson. You'll first hear from Joe, who is joining us today from Cornwall. Joe is a member of our OFS student panel, and she's also a part-time mature student and published author. Welcome, Joe, please.
Hello. So I'm Joe Barlow. I am a mature student currently in my fourth year of the OU studying English literature. I'm also an Office for Student HE panel, and I'm very proud to be representing mature students throughout England. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be a voice for us more mature vintage students, raising awareness of what we face and also what we can bring to the HE experience. Personally, I'm passionate about there being access to HE for everyone that wants it. And I think my motivation to finally take that step was to prove to myself that I could do it, having spent 30 years thinking that I couldn't. There are, however, challenges we face as mature students, mainly centered around confidence and commitment. Confidence, returning to study is a significant hurdle for many students. And I appreciate mature is anybody over 21, which for someone who has clothes older than that is actually quite amusing. But confidence can really take a battering as you get older. And this is certainly the case in my experience. You ask yourself, am I good enough? Am I clever enough? And just speaking here today, I've seen the other speakers' qualifications and titles and felt quite unworthy. I don't even have my degree yet. But then I remember if Michelle Obama can suffer from imposter syndrome, then we all can. My A-levels, taken way back in 1804, were pretty average, but with the OU, who obviously I study with, there were no entry requirements. And that means that somebody with mediocre O or A-levels, but with that all-important life experience, can access HE. However, another challenge, many mature students haven't written an essay or opened an academic textbook in 30, 40, 50 years. And the thought of facing a lecture theatre full of bright young things is very intimidating. Studying at home negates these issues, and that is why for me the OU works. IT is another challenge. I consider myself pretty au fait with IT, but have noticed when we're having HE panel meetings that I'm far behind the other younger students, often finding myself lost in the ether and asking for help. And some students I've worked with have hardly had any experience with computers, and that does provide a massive barrier to learning. The other area of challenge is around commitments, as I said. When my son went to university at age 18, he had no commitments, as it should be at that age. He had a marvellous life-enhancing experience, and I'm immeasurably proud of him. However, studying as a mature student means juggling study with numerous other commitments. My generation is almost certainly the sandwich generation. I, for example, study part-time, I work part-time, I have a sick daughter who lives at home, two elderly parents to care for, plus all the usual day-to-day dramas of life. And I chose the OU because as long as my assignments were in on time, I could fit my study around everything else. Young children at home seems to be another major issue. If you've spent your day running around after a toddler, having enough energy to study at 7 or 8 p.m. is optimistic at best. If you're studying at home, having a suitable space to study can also present a problem. In reality, study space is often the kitchen table. Other members of the family see you sitting down doing nothing, and you're okay to interrupt. And finances too come under the commitments umbrella. If you're working or have a mortgage, becoming a student for 3 or more years is not an option. Getting a degree costs. And I'm of an age where I still smart at the mention of tuition fees, and I still believe education should be free. But I initially rejected the idea of a degree, as with children, there was no way I could have justified spending thousands on a degree. And it wasn't until I realized I could get a student loan that I seriously considered it. In effect, for me, it's free. I'm never going to earn over £25,000. I live in Cornwall. But that's the challenge. What about the good points? Why should the sector encourage more mature students? Mature students actually make the choice to study. They study for a number of reasons, such as to improve or change their career options, especially in the light of the pandemic, a fascination with the subject, or as in my case, is to prove something to themselves. I have a 9-month-old grandson called Arthur. I want to be able to say to him when he comes up against life's hurdles, look, I achieved a degree in my 50s, you can do anything that you want to do. And being a mature student is a truly wonderful experience. It's just doing something for yourself. You spend your life doing things for other people, doing something for yourself is lovely. And I'm so glad I'm studying now. Career-wise, I should have gone to university at 18, but I may well have messed up my studies. I was certainly very immature. Now I'm studying because I want to, because I can, and because I love the subject of English. It's a joy I never would appreciate it at 18. And a mature OUP summed this up perfectly when she said, I was in a bookshop once and mentioned my studies to the assistant. She gazed at me for a few seconds and then asked what on earth I was going to do with it. I felt like crying, but instead I replied, I'm going to frame it. I'm going to put it on the wall and say, look what I've done. And that's what it's like. It's something you've done for yourself. So I would say to the HE sector as a whole, encourage us, please. Encourage more mature students, offer us part-time, flexible, remote learning, try and fit around us. We want to learn. Utilize our life experience. We can bring so much to the HE experience for ourselves, for the providers, and for younger students. And I would say to anyone thinking of being a mature student, do it. Getting older is a gift not afforded to everybody, and don't let anything stand in the way of your dreams.
Thank you so much, Jo, for such a rich description of the lived experience of a mature student. I think it's really great to see and hear that today. Now, I'd like to welcome Professor Liz Johnson from Deakin University, Australia. Liz leads the university's education mission, including major innovation projects in learning and teaching, including whole of institution curriculum reform, online and blended learning design and graduate employability. Her portfolio includes Deakin Learning Futures, which delivers Deakin's online learning environment, supports course development, and also building staff capability for learning and teaching. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you very much, Brooke. It is a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement. I'm talking to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to acknowledge our First Nations people and their elders past, present and emerging. It was terrific to listen to Jo. I think I'm going to be echoing a lot of what she's already said to you, but perhaps putting that in context to what an institution can do to respond to that. My institution, Deakin, enrolls over 65,000 students each year. We're located in southern Australia with physical campuses in Melbourne, the nearby city of Geelong, and in Warrnambool, which is about 3 hours west of Melbourne. Deakin was established over 40 years ago as a dual mode institution, offering study in person and by distance, which has now translated to online education. And at present, we enrol about 30% of our students as online students. The majority of Deakin students, around 47,000 of them, are returning to study after an initial degree or career, carer, or other responsibilities. Adult, or as I like to call them, return to study learners, make up almost all of our online enrolments and are 60% of our on-campus students and 20% of our undergraduate cohort. Our online and adult learners bring quite diverse backgrounds and varying goals. To create conditions for success, it is very important to remember that we can't represent adult learners in a single archetype, but I will draw out some common themes, which, as I said, echo what Jo's been saying to you. Our return to study learners seek flexibility. They're generally juggling study with external commitments and are much more likely to choose online courses and part-time study that they can fit around work and care, noting that in Australia, funding support for part-time study is generally pro rata. Because adult learners are managing considerable complexity, they need reliable information and plenty of forewarning for timetables, assessments, field trips, or workplace learning. They often have less capacity to travel for study. Return to study learners also seek value, with many giving up income to make space for study. They're looking for career advancement or exploration, as Jo's been describing, and will factor in value when making enrolment decisions. Like many students, they're very conscious of the cost of study, and they'll choose enrolment that allows them to continue earning while they study. Adult learners bring variable levels of learning skills. Of course, some return to study learners have completed prior study and have already developed their own approaches to learning. But many need study skill support just as much as those who are transitioning directly from school, and in some very different ways. Any student moving into a new field needs to build confidence in how to learn for that area and will benefit from the opportunities to reflect on their learning. We can't assume that return to study learners are independent learners. Study support and orientation to study are crucial, but need to be provided with personalisation so learners can find what they need when they need it. At Deakin, we've tackled these challenges by building our shared understanding of the experience of our return to study learners and applying it in a coordinated fashion. We used our online courses, which collectively form what we call our cloud campus, as a lens, since almost all these students are adult learners. Insight and action for cloud learners has improved the experience for all Deakin learners. Our approach to understand our learners is multifaceted. We've run in-depth studies of learner experience to understand the diversity of our learners, to identify pain points and grow success. For example, we constructed student journey maps as learners worked their way through a trimester of study, recording student engagement, behaviours and attitudes. And this work has helped us to focus action where we could get most benefit. We include adult learners in advisory and decision-making groups to bring in their experience directly. The important point here is to meet with the students on their terms wherever possible. Adult and online learners often can't attend face-to-face meetings in the middle of the day, so we had to find other ways of supporting participation. Focus and chat groups, feedback through academic support programs and peer mentoring schemes are all important channels. And then to put it to action. Focus on our online learners helped us to coordinate action across broad areas of student learning and experience, including tailored advice and resources for teaching teams, co-creation with our students, and iterative review of points of interaction. Our Cloud Campus team built strong relationships with operational teams to decide on small interventions and larger projects that would be of most value. Sometimes small changes can yield big results. For example, we instituted specific reporting on online students across all reporting categories. That was already in the data, but the reports made it visible and changed conversations. Making these learners a specific priority shifted thinking across the university, and it became everybody's business. The work of the Cloud Campus team has now largely been handed back to operational teams because the focus is now embedded. So in summary, my key messages are: invest in understanding your own adult learners and then embed that learning across the breadth of student learning and experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that really insightful contribution. I'd now like to welcome our three other panelists. I'm going to invite each of them to give a 1 to 2 minute elevator pitch on what they consider to be the opportunities and challenges we face in improving access to higher education for adult learners. I'll first invite Professor Claire Callender. Claire is Professor of Higher Education Policy at UCL Institute of Education, and also Professor of Higher Education Studies at Birkbeck University of London. At UCL, she is Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, an international research centre funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here and would like to start off by thanking the OFS for giving me the opportunity of contributing to this exciting event. The government's proposals for a lifelong learning loan and their commitment to lifelong learning represents a very significant and a very welcome sea change in policy. These are going to be essential if we want part-time higher education in FE as well as in the HE sector, both to survive and to thrive. Part-time undergraduate higher education really matters. It transforms lives and drives the economy. It's central to lifelong learning. It's vital for the advancement of technical and higher technical skills that the country needs. It's central to filling skill gaps, for reskilling, for upskilling the existing workforce, and of course for widening participation and social mobility. I'm beginning to sound like the minister a bit. But, and there's a very important but, since 2010, the number of English domiciled part-time undergraduate entrants attending universities in the UK and English FE colleges has more than halved, which when offset against the continuous rise in full-time entrants actually halted total undergraduate growth. Now, the greatest falls since 2010 have been amongst OU students aged over the 35, those taking level 4 and 5 qualifications, sub-degrees, and linked to that, those on low intensity courses. These are exactly the courses that the government now wants to promote. And from the data on part-time enrollments, it's quite clear that the 2012 funding reforms have played a major role in these falls in part-time numbers. And the key change in 2012 was the introduction of student loan fees for the very first time for part-time undergraduates. But I would argue that student fee loans have actually exacerbated this decline. Most part-time students, in fact, are not eligible for these loans because of their restrictive and inflexible eligibility criteria. And of those who are eligible, the take-up has been poor, especially in comparison to mature students to full-time students, mature students and other students studying full-time. And this is often because mature students are more risk and debt averse. So as a result of this, we now have a sector that is not only smaller, but it's different. The 2012-13 reforms, particularly the loan systems incentives, end up favouring the take-up and the provision of 3-year full-time undergraduate degrees aimed at school leavers. And as a result, the loans have helped narrow the range and flexibility of part-time provision and the characteristics of part-time students. The unintended consequences are that the government funding arrangements for part-time students, their current arrangements, have hampered access, deterred participation, limited upskilling and reskilling opportunities, while undermining widening participation, social mobility and equity, and ultimately hindering national skills development and productivity growth. To conclude, part-time student finances must be reformed, and policies need to acknowledge the distinctiveness of the part-time student population. The very big question is, are the new lifelong learning loans the answer? We've got to remember, if we go back to the 2011 Education White Paper, Students at the Heart of the System, that declared that the new loans that were introduced in 2012 would, and I quote, be a major step in terms of opening up access to higher education and remedies a long-standing injustice in support for adult learners. In reality, the loans have had the contrary effect, very much against the government's expectations and aspirations. So we must ensure that history does not repeat itself if we want part-time provision for mature students to survive and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for those thoughts. I'll now invite Professor Wendy Reid to speak. Professor Reid trained at the Royal Free in London before moving into postgraduate medical education. Appointed as National Medical Director of Health Education England in 2013, Wendy subsequently took on the additional role of HEE's Executive Director of Education and Quality. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the OFS for inviting me to such an interesting seminar. Health Education England has the responsibility to produce the future workforce for the NHS. So the NHS employs about 1.3 million people, depending on how you count them, and about half of them have professional qualifications. So around 150,000 doctors, for example, and 330,000 nurses. And yet, we know we have healthcare shortages. The WHO recently suggested that by 2030, there will be a global shortage of 18 million healthcare workers. And I think, therefore, we know that we can't go on doing more of the same. In this country, the increased demand that we saw from the pandemic has shown us that our healthcare workforce can work differently. We've seen people in extended roles, ranging from final year medical students who graduated early, and nearly 4,000 of them were frontline healthcare workers during the pandemic. So I think we have to not only look at how we produce more healthcare workers with professional skills, but also how they work differently. And we need to embrace a much more inclusive approach to professional learning. And that's why I'm interested in this seminar on increasing the number of mature students that enter the healthcare professions. I know that those people that do graduate entry medical school are really useful doctors. They stay in the NHS and they work really hard and they choose their careers early on. We need to maximize that so that the people we serve are represented by people from their own communities. And that means a much more flexible approach to who goes to study these things. We have a widening participation policy in Health Education England, and I'm very grateful for the support of OFS and other colleagues in trying to meet that. But we need the flexibility that higher education is offering now. Blended learning, learning from home. We heard from Joe about thinking differently about where people choose to learn. I know that people want to work less than full time, so why shouldn't they learn less than full time? And how can we support that better? Mature students make better career choices, they stay in the NHS and they stay locally. All of the things that we need if we're to produce an NHS that can serve the public of the future. So I'm passionate about this. I'd really like to know how we can work more closely together across our sectors to increase the number of people that have the opportunities like I had to either become a doctor, a nurse, or whatever their professional aspirations are in the healthcare world. Thanks very much, Brooke.
Thank you also, Wendy, for such timely reflections, I think tying together our interest in adult education and our current healthcare crisis. I'll now invite Lopa Patel to give her thoughts. Lopa is a digital entrepreneur, non-executive chair, non-executive director, and trustee with strengths in governance and risk oversight. The founder of 2 ventures in online media and a data-driven marketing consultancy, she's also the chair of equality and inclusion charity, Diversity UK. She's a trustee of the Science Museum Group, a non-executive director of the Intellectual Property Office, and a council member of the Open University. Welcome, Lopa.
Thank you very much, Brooke. I won't take up too much time. I just firstly wanted to say congratulations to Joe Barlow. Joe, thank you so much for explaining how you have chosen to study and the challenges you face. And since joining the Council of the OU, everywhere I go, I'm always astonished to learn of somebody who is either taking an OU degree or has done an OU degree or is planning to do one. So well done to all of you. My 2 thoughts were firstly that lifelong learning is here to stay. I know, the minister's mentioned it, Lord Bilimoria has mentioned it, everybody knows it's here to stay, but I just wanted to reiterate that that is a significant change from when I started studying. And what I mean by that as well is there was the old joke that, you know, you started a 3-year degree and what you've learnt in your first year is out of date by the time you get into your 3rd year. And that, in a sense, is pretty true of particularly disciplines in, you know, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths. So technology and pace of change means that we have to continue learning. All the other speakers have mentioned about the need for support. In my mind, I don't see a distinction between part-time studying, full-time studying, intensity. I really don't. It's about what you've learned and how you can apply that knowledge. And technology itself is giving us an opportunity to learn in different ways. It is an enabler for learning, but it can't replace good quality teaching. So I think those two things need to be balanced. In terms of employers, and I think Lord Billy Moria spoke about that, when I started my career, employers had a duty and an obligation to train and educate their employees in their jobs. And I think that has pretty much gone. As an employer myself, we used to invest quite a lot in apprenticeships and training our employees. And the moment they were trained, unfortunately, they would leave. So the balance has shifted to the learner to learn. And I think the only thing I want to end with is I think the lifelong learning entitlement is could be a game changer in enabling people to learn first and then apply the learning to improve their career, change their career, reskill, and refresh. So thank you, Brooke.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Lopa, for those reflections. I'd now like to turn to all of our panelists to start the panel discussion. As I said, I would start to feed questions through. I think all of our panelists will be available to be seen in a gallery view. I see Liz coming up now. Okay, good. So hopefully attendees can all see our panelists as they answer. Thank you all so much for providing us with some questions to kick off this discussion. And what I would like to do is to kick off by throwing the ball first to Claire by asking, what do we need to do to make sure lifelong learning loans work? And what is needed to stimulate demand? You're on mute, Claire.
Yeah. Sorry. First of all, we need to understand what they are. And that may sound very odd, but having read all government documents, all I can learn is that they're going to be available for 4 years worth of full-time study, and they're going to be available for modular study. And they'll be available over the lifetime. We still don't know what the eligibility criteria are, and that's very important. Particularly important is lifting one of the current restrictions on loans, which is the ELQ, namely, if you already have a degree, you can't take another degree. And what's quite clear from Lord Bilomari's presentation is, and the quote that 80% of the 2030 workforce is already in the workforce. If we really are committed to upskilling and improving the skills of the current workforce, then the ELQ regulation has to go. We need to be clearer. We need to understand who's going to get these new loans and what they're going to get them for. Are they going to get them just for tuition fees, or are they going to get them for living costs as well? Will OU, those people doing distant learning, be eligible for the loans for, if there's going to be for maintenance? They're currently not eligible at the moment. And very importantly, which nobody has talked about, what are the terms and the conditions of the repayments? Now, at the moment, full-time students, graduates, they start paying in the April after they graduate. Part-time students currently, very unfairly in my opinion, have to start repaying 4 years after they start their course, even if they're still studying. And what we know is it actually takes 5 or 6 years for somebody to complete an undergraduate degree part-time. In other words, these people are starting to repay their loans before they actually see any benefits. And this is vital, because the whole idea of loans is based that those who benefit pay. The idea is that there is a financial return to your higher education, and therefore loans are both affordable and they're fair. My concern is that the focus of lifelong learning loans are amongst people who are going to take a lower level qualification, whose returns in the longer term are not going to be as great. And the loans, because people's earnings aren't as high as in fact they hope, and the government had hoped, the loans are very expensive. For every £100 a student borrows, the government only gets back £47. So there's an enormous subsidy. And my question is, a government subsidy, and my question is, at what point in time does a very high level of subsidy, would it be better if we actually provided grants instead of loans, if we really want to expand access? So we've got to think much harder about what these loans look like, what the repayment conditions will be. We know already with part-time students that the financial returns to higher education are not as great in the longer term compared with those studying full-time, because they're already earning, but their salaries don't necessarily increase. And indeed, everybody in this room, if you took a modular course tomorrow, would you get a pay rise? Even if you got another degree, would you get a pay rise? It might possibly allow you to move jobs, but would you get a pay rise? And yet loans are based on this idea that you can afford, that there is a financial return to them. So I think this is, you know, to make them work, we have to think through these issues in far greater depth.
Thank you so much, Claire. I think everyone will have found a lot of value in your guidance and steers on that point. Lopa would also like to come in on this question, and then I'll move on to a next question. Go ahead, Lopa.
I agree with what Professor Claire Callender said, but I think she asked the question, would you get a pay rise? Yes, you would. I have managed to do that myself, and I think I would just like to bring in things like CPD, for example. That is what CPD is all about, you know, continuing professional development. If you get a degree or a qualification, you can then negotiate with your employer for that pay rise. And, you know, for continuing professional development, yes, the onus might be on you having to negotiate it, but you should be able to get that. The only other thing I wanted to add is that none of us have discussed value for money. And I think that's critical when we start talking about people, you know, how do you stimulate demand for lifelong learning entitlement? I think we need to focus on the value for money of that model of funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Lopa. Now, I am tempted just to ask Joe to come in very briefly, given we have a mature student on the panel. It might be interesting whether you have a view about whether you used your course to try to increase your salary, kind of an answer to the question we've heard two sides of from Claire and Lopa.
Me personally, no, I haven't. I was made redundant last year for the job I was supporting HE students. And that, for me personally, I just wanted to prove to myself that I could get a degree. As I said in my speech, I should have done it when I was 18. I didn't, and I've spent much of my life thinking I should have done. So for me personally, it was something I wanted to do to prove to myself, not for a financial reason. And also, I won't have to, as I say, I won't have to repay the loan as far as I know, because my salary is significantly lower than 25,000. So for me, no, it wasn't a financial decision.
Lovely. Thanks for coming in on that, Joe. I'd like to I think, Liz, you just raised your hand. I'm going to throw a question to you, so feel free to wrap up your thoughts in the response to the next question as well. The question is, digital, flexible, and blended learning can be used to support a return to learning, but what do universities need to consider to make this type of learning truly accessible for mature learners?
Thank you for the question, Brooke. My comment about the previous discussion was that Australia's had a loan scheme for some considerable time. So there is experience here, and all of the points made have validity. I would encourage people to look at it. It's got advantages and disadvantages, as everything does have, but it's certainly accompanied a large increase in the participation rate across the nation. Getting back to digital and online delivery and supporting mature students, the important thing here is to understand what it is that makes digital delivery worthwhile for those students. So as Joe was describing, a lot of the advantage of digital delivery is about its flexibility, about its access, and that depends on whether or not you've got good digital access. Australia's a big place. There's plenty of it that doesn't have good digital access. So we think a lot about delivery into areas that, for example, don't have good internet access, and how else can we do that? So we offer, for example, courses in a whole range of bandwidths and at various levels of demand. The other point I'd make here is about support for students. The students returning to study may or may not be familiar with working in a digital environment. Joe was describing that she's pretty savvy. Joe, you're getting a lot of attention here because you're our touchstone, really. She feels like she's digital savvy, but then she's not feeling like that in company with others. Actually, you probably are, Joe. The variation in digital literacy amongst students, whether they're leaving school or returning to study, is huge. So the question there is, how do you scaffold that, make it easier for students to find the tools that they need when they need them, not that they have to wait for the next tutorial or the next session, but they can search out tools when they need them. So we've done a lot of investment in self-serve tools, studies, resources, and also things like chat functions, delayed asynchronous chat, so that students can get help straight away. And these things don't have to be highly expensive. You can structure them so that they can support students in a timely and efficient manner.
Thanks very much for that, Liz. Wendy, I'd like to pose the next question to you. How do you think new technologies and recruitment to different styles of courses in teaching, learning, and training will improve opportunities for adults who may be looking to join the NHS?
Great question. And I think the answer is that we're just beginning to learn about those things. I think the NHS is not a single institution. It's multiple small institutions, each with their own highly developed culture. And I think in order to really maximize the role of technology and how we learn and even how we select, we've got to use all bits of that to influence the culture and then go around it again. So this is a really complex area for the NHS. But if I talk specifically about some of the things that we've done with the 5 new medical schools that are the first medical schools for many years to open in England, and they have a specific remit about widening participation. And that is not just from socioeconomic groups, it's from every group. And I think their success in utilising both modern technology and the really gritty local knowledge that allows you to support local endeavours to bring local people into higher professional learning opportunities at your university. I think it's a combination of those things. So I don't think it's all or nothing. I think technology has a huge advantage. I mean, I have conducted my entire life on a screen over the last year. We mobilised thousands of people to support the pandemic. I haven't really had to go to an office to have a meeting. I now don't have to print out all my learning. I can read it on a screen quite happily. So we can learn differently, but translating that at scale to things like recruitment and then the delivery of learning at scale, I think is something we need to spend more time on. And experts like Claire around the funding, experts like Liz around the how you do it, I think we've got to be much more open in this country about learning from others, building on the evidence base, and then listening and rebuilding when things don't work. In the NHS, we're really good at moving on to the next new idea, but perhaps not spending the time to reflect on what we've learned and what we need to do differently. I think that's what the pandemic has taught me and my organisation, is that we can do things differently. We're now looking at whether that's the right way of doing them or not. And I think closing that conversation is really important before we leap in and say, this is how we're going to recruit nurses, doctors, physios for the future. So a lot more work to be done. And I think, it's great Joe's here. I have lots of conversations with different types of students, but I think we need to listen more about experiences and feed them back in a much more effective way.
Thank you, Wendy. And you've set me up perfectly for my next question, which is to Joe. How do you perceive the benefits of remote learning versus the barriers of access to tech and the confidence in tech? And what do you think that universities can do to support that balancing act, Joe?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult one, because it's like a chicken and egg situation. If you can't work a computer, or you can't actually access IT. I've worked with students that when you say press Control Alt Delete, they don't know what to do. So this is the very, very basic. And I think definitely learning at home, online learning, is the most beneficial for mature students because it's flexible. But I think if it was me, if you could have community-based basic IT group, like an hour-long session. When I work with students, after an hour, they realize it actually wasn't that scary. As long as you can do the basics, you'll be okay. So if there perhaps were community-based local IT sessions, and then obviously IT support after that online, that would help. I think also it's also talking about the access to IT. If we're talking about students from low-income backgrounds, they may not have that access at home. They may not have, as this was saying, sufficient broadband. Down here in Cornwall, if it's windy, the broadband goes. So, and I'm sure that's true for lots of people. So it's ensuring that investing in giving students the IT that they need, and then training them to use it, I think. And then once those sort of foundations are in place, then students are sort of are free to learn at home around their commitments.
Thanks very much, Joe. I imagine Lopa might have some thoughts on that, and I have a question for Lopa. So again, Lopa, feel free to reflect on either what Joe said and/or answer this question directly. Some adults might struggle with the confidence to enter HE because of negative previous experiences and lack of digital skills. How can organizations work together to encourage a diverse population of adult learners into STEM or digital areas?
Thank you, Brooke. Yeah, technology. For all of you who are struggling with broadband access, I do have some good news. Firstly, don't forget 5G is on the horizon. Our mobile companies are working incredibly hard to bring 5G through. And actually, if you have a balance between broadband and 5G, I noticed BT's advertising that, that their broadband is backed up by EE. All of that is fantastic news because it means you have a uniform, consistent, reliable, high frequency network. So there is, good things on the horizon. Just to pick up on the question, obviously, I think it is about access. I think that there should be an onus on higher education institutions to make sure that everybody's at the same level in terms of access to technology and ability to use that technology. The government has focused quite a lot on STEM because that's where the biggest gaps are at the moment: digital skills, cyber skills, AI skills, and they've announced a conversion course, for example. And I would love to see that extended. The conversion courses at the moment, I think, are focused on you can retrain in AI because that's where the real demand is. It would be great to see that extended to lots of other courses and even just, entry level digital, so that the baseline from which we're all starting is much higher. The thing that's interesting, and I don't believe I'm saying this as a scientist and as a STEM champion, but actually it's more than about just science. It is about communication skills. It's about creative thinking, the ability to write. So all the arts courses are just as valuable as science courses. And I think that's why the government needs to think about a lot more conversion courses just to get everybody up to the same level.
Thank you very much, Lopa. I now would like to return to Claire with a question from Professor Carl Ligo, the Vice Chancellor of Arden University. He says, encouraging mature students with busy lives also means that the usual metrics for full-time learners aged 18 to 21 and the financial support rules are not the most appropriate measures for English higher education. Do you agree? What flexibility is needed in the future regulatory regime to encourage providers to better serve the mature student market? Just an easy question there for you, Claire. Over to you. And you are muted.
I mean, absolutely. It's not just the regulations, but it's also the way ministers tend to think. When you say students, they're thinking about an 18-year-old school leaver who is who has limited or no work experience. So it's very important to try and get a different mindset in terms of a mature student with work experience, not new to the labour market necessarily, and who has a range of other responsibilities, as Joe has talked about. And indeed, part of the problem with the policies is the way in which they don't acknowledge that the characteristics of part-time students. And it isn't just regulation, it is even down to what data are collected. So, for example, there are national data on tuition fees for full-time students. There is no comprehensive data on tuition fees for part-time students. There is national data on the take-up of loans amongst part-time students. There is no published data on the take-up of loans for part-time students. And if you want to understand, if the government is going to want to understand how these new loans are working, they're going to have to start collecting data nationally, regularly, to monitor the impact of any policy changes. And we know already, and there's already documents produced by the government that the regulations are going to have to be changed. So at the moment, the regulations only allow for loans to be provided for people taking a full degree. Now it's clear that the regulations are going to have to be changed so that they will be available for modular provision. Although we still, as I said earlier, we don't have a definition of what that modular provision looks like. And we still don't have an operational credit framework to facilitate the government's aspiration for students to be able to move from one institution to another. So, yeah, Carl is completely right. We need a mega change.
Thank you, Claire. Moving to Liz, there's a question that says, adult education has shrunk over the last 20 years and England now lags behind our international competitors. What are other countries doing? I think in your context, you could speak helpfully to Australia, that we aren't. And what impact is adult education having in Australia? But of course, the question says having elsewhere. So please feel free to speak about your own knowledge of other contexts as well.
I'll probably stick to Australia, Brooke, but we'll see how we go. The fastest growing enrolment cohort for our university, which is the biggest university in Australia for domestic enrolments, not the biggest overall, but the biggest for domestic enrolments. The largest growing cohort is a postgraduate one. They're people who are returning to study. There's a great deal of interest in Australia about what the minister referred to as modular study. That is, moving study into bite-sized pieces, which then stack towards a credential or a set of skills that you need. An interesting discussion before about whether or not that brokers a pay rise. I suspect it depends a great deal which sector you're in. The question about how do we what the benefit is to those learners and how do they orient themselves towards institutions? Well, the first step is the institution has to see them as learners. And so part of the advantage of making sure that you actually meet your students, particularly your return to study, I call them, or adult learners, is that you start to shift that mind frame about what a learner looks like. And once you do that, you open the door to thinking about interacting with learners wherever they are. One of the things we discovered pretty early on is that there's a fairly large proportion of our own staff who are studying either at our university or at other institutions, which we encourage, by the way. So they're learners too. They're adult learners returning to study. They're great secret shoppers, I've got to say, but they're also shifting our attitudes about what learners look like. Now, once you start that view, then it shifts the marketing, it shifts the discussion in the community, it shifts the discussion with community groups, with partners. It does shift the discussion in schools. Even in schools, we talk to schools about lifelong learning, career opportunities beyond the first degree. So you're starting to have a bigger conversation about what lifelong learning really looks like. The idea of modular learning is rapidly rising across the world. You can see it in the rise of the MOOC platforms, and they have their own problems, mostly to do with retention and with the quality, the variable quality of what's offered there. But you can see this shift towards just in time, just for me, my place, my way kind of learning. And we need to join in that to make sure that longer form learning, like degrees, finds their right place in that.
Thank you very much, Liz. Oh, yes, perfect. Wendy, I'd like to invite you in on that. And then I have a question for you as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to back up what Liz has said in the NHS, which is a huge employer. Yeah, the best employers look at everybody in a learning situation. That's what we want. You know, if you're not lifelong learning in the NHS, then should you be there will be my question. But there's a real key role for employers here to recognise that and value it. And I do think that modular learning, just-in-time learning, you know, we saw that for COVID. We rolled out e-learning modules, just-in-time clinical learning on site for thousands of people. What we haven't done is found a way of valuing that for their future careers. Now we're working on that, but I think it's a really key point that employers have got to see their staff as potential learning hotspots. And that will change their performance as employers in terms of the level of care or whatever it might be. So I'm really keen that we have that joined up conversation with employers. It's beginning to work in the apprenticeship world in healthcare. I recognise what one of our previous speakers said, that it's very clunky. But you know, we are really pushing boundaries with that. For example, you know, we're about to start work on an apprenticeship for, you know, to become a doctor. That not without its controversy, but it is a major sea change in the way of thinking about how people will learn in the future. But it's key to have employers engaged.
Thanks, Wendy. That's a really helpful mention of the apprenticeship for medicine, because the next question asks, well, it says, you mentioned the possibility of part-time training for NHS workers. Are there any part-time medical or nursing degrees available in the UK? And if not, is it feasible to develop part-time degrees, particularly in medicine? So maybe you can expand a bit more.
Yes, I mean, we've struggled with developing part-time degrees, particularly in medicine, because of the length of the course. And in the UK, it varies between 5 or 6 years, depending on which university you go to, and a 4-year graduate course. So part-time is very, very time heavy then. And also it's quite hard in terms of the mix of how learning is delivered. In a traditional course, it's quite hard to break it down into part-time, which is why we think one of the ways to address that will be to look at an apprenticeship model where it's learn and earn at the same time. We're deliberately using the language apprenticeship. There's lots and lots of baggage that goes with that word in the medical world. You know, are we apprentice learners in postgraduate medicine or not? There's a huge amount of tradition around that. But I think that we've got to be as flexible as we expect our future workforce to be. And if we're not flexible in the offer of their professional education, how do we expect to produce a flexible and adaptable workforce in the future? And I go back to my earlier comment that increasing numbers in both doctors and nurses in employment want to work less than full-time for a variety of reasons. It is not gender specific and it is not age specific. People want a mix of careers and a mix of life events that they can have through their work. And therefore, why would we not see that reflected in what the learning population at university level want? And I think we've got to be as flexible as possible. Otherwise, we will end up recruiting the same people that look like us, that have always looked like us and will behave like us. And that is no longer sustainable. It's not affordable. It's not the right thing to do for the population. And it certainly doesn't feel to me the fair way to deliver the future workforce.
Thank you, Wendy. Lopa, would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, I just, there are some comments I've noticed in the Q&A around pay rises and, you know, whether the employer should contribute towards learning, etc. And I just wanted to pick up on what Wendy was saying. I'm absolutely delighted that that is happening in the health service. But I just want to draw your attention to what Karen Billamoria said earlier. 99% of businesses in Britain are now small businesses, you know, SMEs. So the apprenticeship levy scheme has just not worked for that audience. And I think therefore there needs to be a shift, and there is already a shift, that it's now the onus for learning is on the individual, and then the ability to negotiate you know, for a pay rise, for a new job, is now falling on the individual rather than the business. And that's because our economy has shifted, you know, from the industrial revolution right through to the information economy that we are in now. The balance has shifted, and I think people need to appreciate that. So I think it's great that, you know, organizations like the health service, the civil service, the government-led public sector do invest in employees, and it's quite right that they should. But I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that the private sector is very, very different. And whatever the lifelong learning entitlement is going to be, it needs to work as much for the private sector as it does for other sectors. Thank you.
Thanks, Lopa. Really helpful to have that perspective as well. I'd like to pose this question for Joe. Taking the decision to enter education as an adult is a big one. What was the tipping point that made you decide the time was right? And how would you encourage providers, universities and colleges, to engage with potential adult students?
Okay, my tipping point was actually, as I said earlier, I was supporting HE students, and I didn't have a degree. And one of the girls, students I was working with, had just been made homeless, was living in a travel lodge with 2 children under 5, writing her assignments and work. And I thought, my goodness, if she can do that, then, you know, I really should pull my finger out and do it. Plus, as I said, my son, I was so proud of him. I wanted my family to be as proud of me as I was of him. And regarding the access, this is something I put in my speech and took out because it was too long. But the students I worked with, it's that can I do it? Am I good enough? I haven't got a GCSE, math, etc., etc. And that's the big barrier. It's getting them actually in. And once they're in and they've got that support, and they actually realise once they've had the support, they can do it on their own. It's getting them over that hurdle. And I think going back to sort of short courses or modular study, if at the start of each, either before the degree starts or as the first module, is to have like possibly access, but formative assignment so that students can actually see how good they are, what needs working on. So they've actually got that input before they start the degree, because the students I've worked with are actually, once they've got into it, are a lot better than they actually thought they were. And it's just getting over that sort of mental hurdle first of all. And then once they've got the support, they fly.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Joe. I'd like to return to Claire. We've had a couple questions come in around HE culture and its ability to cater to and acknowledge the particular needs of adult learners. A very specific question is, how can any loan scheme support academic institutions to upskill their staff to prepare for the future and better prepare and support the student experience for adult learners? You're on mute there, Claire.
I mean, staff would, the majority of staff would be ineligible for loans because presumably they already have a qualification. So unless the LQ is changed, I'm somewhat doubtful that academic staff would be eligible for loans in their own right. Is that what the question is asking? Sorry.
It seems that is, I mean, I read the question as it's written, so it does seem to be asking that, but I wonder if it's really just a little bit more broad as well. So, you know, within maybe ignoring the loan scheme itself, what types of support might need to be implemented within providers to upskill their own staff in order to address?
Well, there's two different things. There's about an upskilling, but there's also about creating the atmosphere within the institution to facilitate and help part-time students. So as you know, I work both at Birkbeck and at UCL. If I wanted a cup of coffee at UCL after 4:30, I'm in trouble. Now, all the teaching at Birkbeck takes place in the evening. In Birkbeck, all the canteens, all the facilities are open. They're open at the weekend. At UCL, they're not. So if we're going to do part-time teaching in the evenings, whereby students can fit in their studies, this is face-to-face, where they can fit in their studies in and around existing commitments, commitments, family commitments, work commitments, then we also need to rethink about the structure of what's on site for those students in a way that makes it just a much more enjoyable and realistic experience. So if I go to, I'm not trying to criticize UCL, but it's the contrast between an institution, Birkbeck, that you know, where part-time education is completely, utterly central to its mission, as against UCL, where it isn't. And indeed, you know, one of the big problems is how to incentivize institutions to provide part-time provision. And that's one of my big questions. And I don't think it's something that we've addressed enough about how we actually get I mean, we need incentives for students to study part-time. So we need a funding system that's attractive for them to do so. And that would include staff working at institutions. And we also need an incentive system for more further education colleges and universities and HE providers to have part-time courses that actually are tailored to part-time students. Because one model is that, okay, that part-timers are learning alongside full-timers, but for many people that really is not a model that works for them. You know, it presupposes that they're not working full-time. So you do need provision that is tailored for the needs of people who have family commitments, work commitments, etc.
Thank you so much, Claire. Lopa and Liz would both like to come in. So I'm sorry, I didn't see who raised their hand first. So I'll go to Lopa and then Liz. Thanks.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up, we've talked a lot about universities, but obviously there are lots of other types of institutions, FE colleges, HE. But the one thing I want to mention is technology itself. Google is a big educator, who hasn't learned something from looking at a YouTube video? So I think when we talk about the future, we might need to just think about the institutions being of a different format. That was the only comment. I don't disagree with anything Claire said. It was just to say, institutions are of various types. Thank you.
Helpful reminder. Thank you, Lopa.
My comment is really about the benefit of thinking more broadly about what support you provide, what environments you provide. We find that when we deliberately cater for diversity in the student population, whether it's part-timers, mature learners coming back, students who have special needs, what we actually do is end up improving it for everybody. So inclusive education, we don't regard as a separate thing. When we solve challenges in inclusive education, as broadly as that may come across, we generally improve it for everybody. A good example here is we moved a decade ago to a trimester system, where instead of having 2 semesters in a year, we now have 3. We brought it in to allow some students to accelerate their learning. What we actually did was increase flexibility so students could adjust their learning across the year depending on what else they had on their plates. And that varies from mums who are juggling school-age kids, people who are caring for elderly relatives, people who are juggling jobs, people who are juggling local community commitments. The ability to be flexible, which we thought was going to be used one way, ended up having a much broader application. Good teaching and good experience support is good for everybody.
Thank you, Liz. I'm conscious of time now, and we just have a couple more minutes really before we need to wrap up. What I thought would be a nice way of wrapping up is maybe if I could ask you each in 30 seconds, what are your kind of last final thoughts? What's the most important thing that you'd like the attendees today to leave with that you might feel is the most influential or certainly the most impactful from your particular perspectives? And Liz, I might just start with you since you last had the floor.
So my message is listen to your mature learners, listen to your adult learners. The people who are with you will tell you what works and what doesn't work. Go and ask them and find out.
Very simple and straightforward. Thank you. It's a great one. Can I go to Lopa next, please?
Okay, I think just to reiterate, the pace of change has quickened. Reskilling and upskilling are absolutely essential, because the greatest threat is not each other, it's automation. And in terms of institutions, I think just want to give a shout out to the national treasure that is the Open University. And the fact that it offers a lot of flexibility through Open Learn and Future Learn for all types of students. So please take a look at the OU.
Thank you, Lopa. May I go to Joe next, please?
Yes, I would absolutely second that. The OU is, I absolutely love it. It's wonderful. It means I can study around everything, and hopefully it will encourage others to do so. But I would say to HE providers that this mature students, we are this massive untapped market. People have lost jobs in the past year or so. We're here, we want to learn. Please take advantage of that situation. Help us learn and hear what we have to say. And also to anybody that wants to be a mature student, please go for it, because it's wonderful. It's really life enhancing.
Thank you, Joe. Can I hand to Claire, please?
I think the lesson is learn from the disaster of the loans for part-time students, as a result of the 2012 changes. We don't want to see another fantastic fall in the number of part-time entrants, and including the OU. I mean, the OU, although their numbers have increased, there's still a 40% reduction in numbers relative to before the funding changes. So yeah, learn and pay enormous attention to the detail, because these loans and new loans and lifelong learning loans, it really is, the devil will be in the detail, and we still know so little about what they're going to look like in reality, and try and anticipate some of the unintended consequences of changes.
Thank you, Claire. And finally to Wendy.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you. I've learned a huge amount. I guess my message is please consider working in the health service. And my other message is to Joe, I think I really need to do an OU course. It sounds fantastic. You've inspired me. So thank you very much to everybody. I've just learned an enormous amount.
Well, let me thank you all on behalf of OFS and the attendees today for such rich contributions and a very, very interesting discussion. I'll now hand over to Chris.
Okay, thanks, Brooke, and thanks also to all the panelists, Joe for your personal insights, Claire and Lopa for your expert views, and Liz and Wendy for showing us how it looks from a different country, and also, of course, from our largest and most important employer in many ways. I was just going to pull out three themes, it seems to me, from that panel session. So firstly, there is enthusiasm for lifelong loans. We've heard how they've made a difference in another country. We've heard how they reflect the mix of careers and life that people are looking for now. But there are issues to be addressed in their design to stimulate demand, to get good returns for everyone involved in it. And part of that is also thinking about how data is collected, how it's regulated to reflect the characteristics and the patterns of flexible learners. And we need to make sure that they work well for both the private and the public sector employers. The second point I was going to pick out was the opportunities we've talked about for digital and online learning, but the need to scaffold support for older learners so they can work in this way, and to do so in a way that applies local knowledge. So some good examples from Wendy around how that's worked in medical education. Also, crucially, to listen to the students, listen to the experience of students, and create communities of learners. And we heard one reference to learning hotspots in the workplace that could achieve that. And of course, there was a good phrase around inclusive education improves education for everyone, which I think is a key message for this session. The third thing I was just going to flag was the value of conversion courses in the particular context of digital skills and STEM subjects. And Lopa talked about extending that beyond the AI program that OFS is currently running with support from DCMS. We heard that globally postgraduate education is really crucial for that. Also, students building up from shorter courses through to full degrees. So those are just three insights for me from what we heard. I'm just going to finish off by reflecting on where this leaves us and what OFS will be doing. So this is the fourth Insight event we've run in the OFS, and in many ways it's been, I think, the most inspiring for me. One of my parents spent 8 years during my childhood studying for an OU degree, having left school at the age of 15. And her graduation was the hardest earned, but also, of course, the most celebrated of any in our family. I've also spent a lot of time since I started in this role meeting with students who are supported through universities and colleges' access and participation plans. And my experience is that the most passionate and insightful accounts have often been from mature students. Unlike many other students, they can identify clearly why they are there, often a highly personal change in circumstances, children leaving home, for example, or the loss of a partner, often work-related, redundancy or a change of job, promotion or failure to get promoted, or just what was needed for the job, professional accreditation, the use of the latest technology and techniques. I've also heard a lot about the challenges, and we've heard some of that today, remembering how to study, learning how to study independently, juggling work, family and studies, but also crucially the benefits. So you hear people, we hear adult learners say things like, I never thought I could do that. It changed the way I think. I know now what I don't know. I'm more ambitious for my children. I'm not just improving my own work, I'm changing the work around me. So that was all really important when I first started in this job in 2018. And I would argue that it's more important than ever now, as we recover from the pandemic and we have new opportunities due to the innovations in learning and teaching we've heard about today. and of course the government's plans to reshape the financing of lifelong learning. Also, the very strong new imperatives for learning later in life as jobs change and people need to retrain, but also, in my view, to address what we're seeing in terms of lost learning in schools and colleges. If we want to make progress and continue to make progress on fair access during the coming years, we're going to need to give students more time, and mature students entering higher education is then going to be crucial for that. In OFS, we're supporting this in 3 ways. So firstly, we're shifting the focus of our information, advice and guidance work so it's more tailored to the needs of mature students. That includes more tailored advice for mature students through the Discover Uni website on issues like what and where to study, student finance, the application process and returning to study. It also means extending the outreach work of the Uni Connect partnerships we fund so that it reaches adults and communities, not just schools, and supports more people to progress from further through to higher education. Secondly, we're discussing with universities and colleges how they may change their access and participation plans that they've agreed with us during the coming years, in part to meet increased demand locally from adults, but also to build on the new models of learning they've developed during the pandemic. Thirdly, we're working with the government on the design of a pilot which could test demand from students and employers for the more flexible and modular provision that will be supported through the lifelong learning entitlement, and we'll provide further details of the approach to that later in the year. As I hope you've heard from others this morning, there is no more important issue than this in higher education currently, so we really look forward to working with you on it during the coming years. Please do read and respond to the insight briefing we've published today, which picks up many of the themes that we've been talking about. Beyond that, just to finish off, could I say thank you again to all of our speakers, the Minister, Michelle Donnellan, Lord Billy Moria, Joe, Claire, Lopa, Liz and Wendy. Also the OFS team, Abigail, Kerry, Sandra, Brooke, Chris and Henny for organising this, and above all to all of you for attending. I think we heard from Lord Billy Moria the phrase "seize the moment" at the start of this session, and this really is the time to seize the moment for adult learning in higher education. That's it from me. All the best for all your work. Thank you very much.